Hi all, this is part 3, the final version of the podcast for the Monday of week 3, covering chapter 24. We've introduced both the idea of Fortbildung and also the concept of the subject and how it's used in this form called the fugue. We'll talk a little bit more about invention on Wednesday and Friday, but the fugue is certainly the more interesting of the two forms, mainly because it involves more voices. In all of the Bach fugues, the publisher always tells you how many voices are being used. I thought I would share this one. This one is discussed in detail on page 494. This is the C major fugue from the Prelude and Fugue in C major from Book 1 of Well-Tempered Clavier. These are all preludes and fugues written in every single key. He wrote two books of them for his children. Who had the advanced keyboard skill to play them, but they're really wonderful pieces. The breadth of variety and complexity and beauty in each one is really staggering to me. This is an example of a fugue that uses a real answer. We looked at the C minor fugue before this, and that used a tonal answer. We know that it's a real answer, right? Because here, the subject that we see that takes up about 1.5 measures, and it enters here, is an exact transposition of the original subject over here. You see that? No intervals have changed. The only difference between this appearance of the subject and this subject is that it's transposed up to the dominant. Now, fugues always introduce their subjects, however many voices. We'll hear 4 subjects that will repeat almost identically, but they'll be in transposition with each other, right? So here, this one starts in C, it ends, we hear the answer starting at G. Now we will expect, in most cases, to hear the next subject come back to C, although sometimes it repeats at the dominant as well, and we see that here. Here's the third instance of the subject. So we would expect this either to be at C transposition or the dominant transposition. But then look what happens here. The final instance of the subject right here is back at C. 4 subjects, each with a relationship to the tonic and the dominant. And what's really cool about this is that it's a real answer. Bach wrote way more tonal answers than he did real answers, so I always feel like this is kind of special when we find a real answer. So when all of the subjects have entered, and you've heard all of them, that's when he starts to get involved with this idea of developing the subject. Now, when the first appearance of the subject besides the initial appearance, which we call the answer, this one right here, when that begins, this is when the counterpoint starts to get interesting. Anytime we have a subject, in most cases, a subject playing, we'll have what's called a counter subject. And you can see that the rhythm is quite different, right? This is counterpoint, when you can clearly hear 2 distinct melodies going on at the same time. But what makes Bach so wonderful is that he's doing it with sometimes 3, 4, even 5 and 6 voices at a time. So there's a lot going on. But remember, the goal is to see that all of the material that we hear in this fugue is derived from the subject, or in this case, the counter subject. So a subject is never longer than 1, 2, or 1.5 or 3 measures. The reason why is because you might either lose interest in it or you wouldn't remember it. It has to really be memorable, even from the first listening. So let's just listen to the opening of this fugue. This opening is called the exposition. That's because we've heard all 4 subjects enter, make their appearance, and as soon as that's done, we begin a series of episodes. So think of it as the exposition is like a TV pilot, and the episodes are those that follow. Okay, bring this back here. And this is played on a harpsichord. Here, first subject, answer. Third subject, the final appearance. Episodes begin. So as you listen to a fugue, and we'll talk more about all these little compositional ideas that Bach and other composers at this time used to develop and change the subject. But remember, the goal is not to really invent new material. It's to take something like this very opening subject and then to spin it out, like we talked about in the first video. It's really an amazing concept. So any fugue that you listen to, especially the Bach fugues, you'll hear this idea of the exposition. What is the exposition? It's when you've heard all voices enter with the subject and they operate in relationship to the initial appearance of the subject, in this case being at the tonic, C major, dominant, dominant, and tonic. Occasionally he would do tonic, the answer would be at the dominant, he might bring in the third voice at tonic, but that would mean that the fourth voice then would be at the dominant and again. And that is what characterizes the fugue exposition.